bring up my schedule, but we're calling this the problem-solving panel. I know that this past year, actually the past 2 years, have been especially challenging with late wet springs, and with this year, just wet continuously all the way through the season. I know a lot of people were harvesting corn and even soybeans into late December here in Wisconsin. So I'm going to have each of the panelists kind of introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their operations, and then we're going to launch into a bunch of questions. And I think after each of the questions, we'll take a few questions on the same topic from the audience, and then we'll move on to the next question. So if those of you in the exhibit hall want to join us here, they can't hear me over there. Okay, so I will turn over. So I'm Harriet Behar, and I work with O'Grain.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tor Oshner, and I hail from the Finger Lakes region in New York State. And they flew me all the way out here to solve all the problems of the thing. And we have a 1,400-acre organic crop farm. We're focused on growing food-grade grains, and we've been certified organic since the early 90s. I forget what year it was. So we've been at it for kind of a long time, and you know, I just want to say I think this is a really great group here. We have a similar thing in New York called NICO, where farmers get together and share ideas, and it's not nearly as organized or large as this. But you know, when I was starting out as a organic grain farmer, it was really helpful to have other guys who've had experiences and had made a lot of mistakes, be able to, you know, ask a lot of what I thought at the time was stupid questions and not be judged by it. And I think that's a really great thing, and I'm glad to be here. So. I got everybody's heads up. Everyone awake?
Skip those mics. My name's John Wepking. I farm. Our team is in Ridgeway, Wisconsin. I farm with Paul Bickford, who's our boss and mentor. My wife, Hallie, Paul's son, Levi, and my father, Dwayne, is part-time on the farm as well. We raise about 800 acres of organic crops, and Hallie and I have a totally grass-fed grazing cow-calf beef herd that we raise animals up to slaughter, and they don't eat any of the grain we raise, which presents some challenges sometimes when you're swimming in grain screenings. And like Tor, we focus a lot on value-added food-grade distilling markets and focus heavily in small grain and drilled crops, just because our whole farm is highly erodible. We're sort of on the ridge tops of the driftless, and so that presents a lot of unique soil conservation challenges as well.
All right, good morning, team. My name is Jared Seiverling. I tend to talk too much, too fast, too loud. I'm from Bloomer, Wisconsin, which is way farther north of here than you can probably imagine, up by the polar bears. 450 acres. We've been doing organic compliant trials about a decade now, but we certified half the farm this year, and the remaining will be in 21. 11 different crops, mostly a corn, bean, and hay rotation. Quick how I got here is I call it near organic, which they don't pay a premium for that. But we still spray because we had to spray. When I was overseas about a decade ago, my dad for Christmas mailed me a book. There's this young fella and his daughter. The guy's name was Zimmer, and he'd written this book. And in it, he had an idea of how you could farm without those chemicals. And so I got home with, by the way, as a side note, I later met that guy and shook his hand because I wouldn't be farming organically if I hadn't met him. But this guy had a rotary hoe and a Buffalo cultivator, so I got home with way too much deployment money, and I bought both those tools because all I was going to do, right, you just cultivate like 14 times, you won't have any weeds. That's how that works. And we were having some struggles with that, and I went online and I found another young guy, and his name was Groover, and he was way south of me down in Illinois, but he was doing some things with tillage and cultivation. He was having clean organic crops. As a side note, I met that guy later, and I shook his hand and I thanked him because I would not be farming successfully organically if it wasn't for his research. And he had this 80-acre research plot down in Illinois, and I started going down there because he was doing some fascinating thing without any funding from the university. He taught full-time, and he and his technician, Andy, ran this program. And he had some, he had a doctorate, but he had some really crazy ideas, like you don't just rotary hoe twice because you don't just rotary hoe 3 days after planting blindly. You rotary hoe when it's time to rotary hoe, and you cultivate when it's time to cultivate. And he also had this crazy idea about, a little embarrassed to share it, but he like no-tilled small grains into corn stubble, and he didn't disc like 5 times first, and he had like really good weed pressure and stands. And he also, this thing with like rye and crimping it and soybeans having great yields. And I didn't talk too much about it, it was kind of a little bit weird, but I thought, well, maybe, that's great on that potting soil down in central Illinois, but maybe somebody else is doing this a little farther north, because that's a 14-hour round trip. And there's a small college, I think it might be a community college in Madison, University of Wisconsin. They got a rodent as their mascot, but they're good. And I met a young lady, and her name was Silva, and she was doing some fascinating thing with reduced tillage. And by the way, as a side note, when I met her, I shook her hand and I thanked her heartily, because I would not be farming successfully, organically, and regeneratively if it wasn't for her work. And that's kind of where we're at, because if you plagiarize enough people along the way, you can learn some really fascinating things. And we're here today to talk a little bit about some of the new problems that all of us in this room are learning how to deal with.
Okay. Hello? Is that working? Yes. Okay, so I'd like to ask each of you, how have you built resilience, especially climate resilience, into your current operation? And feel free to share any painful or pertinent learning experiences regarding climatic extremes that have impacted your farm.
All right, I'll start off here. So, in terms of, I'm going to start out with the painful part. And I know you in the Midwest have had a really wet year. A few years ago, at my farm, we got 5.5 inches of rain in just under an hour. It came down, and nobody in my area had ever seen anything like it. And we've been getting a lot of really heavy rains, and within the last 5 years in Tompkins County, we've had the driest year on record, 2 of the wettest years on record, and some just these rainfalls that just come down, hailstorms, which we usually don't get in New York, things like that, where I think going forward, climate is going to be really difficult to deal with. So we lost a lot of soil. It came down right when the corn was about 4 inches tall. And that really changed my mind about what I was doing. A lot of moldboard plowing, and that having trash on the surface to try to mitigate and absorb some of that water, that was one thing that taught me I really needed to change the way I was doing my tillage. And the other thing we did is we started really going down to the NRCS office, and I was up visiting John's farm, and they had some beautiful contour strips there. But we started putting more of them in, looking at the Russell II equation and figuring out exactly where we had to be in terms of keeping our soil and having strips to block soil movement across our farm. And also just double down on trying to build organic matter and work on doing more no-till stuff. So I think being resilient on a crop farm is a number of different things, and we're also, I'm going to talk about this in my keynote, so I won't go into it, but just looking at a crop rotation and have part of that crop rotation and how we think about it be, how do we protect the soil and guard against these weather extremes, and I think that has to be forefront in our mind. I mean, I have the mentality that, I'm on this soil for so long and I want to improve it and pass it on to the next generation, and I take that really seriously, and sometimes it means that I don't get a cash crop off the soil every year, and if that's what it's going to take to keep the soil there, without healthy soil base, we don't have a healthy country. Other thing we started to realize is that the windows were getting shorter in terms of when we could get in the field and work the soil, so we weren't damaging it. So we started buying larger equipment so we could go in and get a lot more done faster. The other thing that has helped us in terms of, not talking about soil, but just where we have more possibility of crop failures is, bringing an added value enterprise into what we were doing on our farm to try to make what we were growing worth more when we had it, and also have an income stream when crops didn't necessarily do good. And I'll talk more about the value-added part of my operation later on. But those are a few ideas that I had in terms of resilience. So I'm going to pass her off to John.
I echo a lot of that. Our two farms, we have very different rocks underneath the soil, but pretty similar slopes and conditions, and with similar crops. I think I pretty much echo a lot of that. The thing that I thought of that I would add to this part of the conversation is to talk about reintegrating livestock, in particular grazing cattle. When Hallie and I started working for Paul, the first thing we did to try to start building equity as we thought about buying into the farm was to get a FSA microloan. I think it was right at the $50,000 cap. It's really an easy underwriting process, and that bought us 22 heifers and a bull from 2 different herds, and had our first calves in the spring of 2016. We had our first market animals in 19 from that, and our long-term goal is to really build up that herd so that we have an equilibrium on the farm between the amount of hay we have to make in our cropping rotation and the amount of alfalfa and clover we grow, and the amount of mouths we have to feed. And obviously on a really steep farm, there's a lot of ground that is better served with livestock on it, with grazing animals on it, than annual crops, certainly. And in the Driftless is a really interesting place to do that, because we do have the dairy history and the infrastructure and a lot of expertise around grazing, but the topography makes it right for grazing, but to integrate it into a grain farm that's on 90-foot contour strips makes it really difficult to integrate grazing in a systematic way into your crop rotation. You can't fence off a series of alternating strips and get water out and all this kind of stuff even on a 3, 4, 5-year basis. I think in a lot of ways further south into the grain belt in Illinois and Indiana and Iowa, where the ground is closer to flat, in a lot of ways there's as many, if not more, opportunities to integrate livestock into cropping rotations in a way of like the way Jack Harrisman and other farmers have done it. In a lot of ways I wish I could graze cattle on that kind of ground, because it's a lot easier to you don't have to move the manure around and things like that. But the other piece there is we're obviously trying to reduce our reliance on off-farm inputs as much as we can by using legumes for nitrogen, but then also using the cattle to keep as many of the nutrients on the farm, and then use those in our fertility program. I think that as we go further on down the road, and Fred spoke to this yesterday, off-farm inputs are going to get more and more expensive and scarce, and they're absolutely not renewable. So a really, sustainable, regenerative path forward has to involve farms producing their own fertility, and I think livestock is the centerpiece of that.
All excellent points. My last one, actually, just to concur, is that I do predict that these climate extremes are going to drive the return of cattle to many operations, because I know most of you who've all ripped out your fences, you're really excited about getting to fix fence again. But it's going to become the new normal, and about 20% of our farm in 21 will be a pasture corn rotation, hopefully. And by the way, though, the good news there is whether you're talking Mr. Gabe Brown, Mr. John Kempf, Dr. Groover, when you get cattle back on the land, it does something to turbocharging that organic matter and the fertility, and these gentlemen talked on it. Some other notes is, again, Simon Sinek has a fantastic new book out called The Infinite Game, and he talks about a finite game versus an infinite game, the World of Warcraft versus basketball. And we could look at these reduced tillage systems and we could say, okay, my conventionally tilled soybeans yielded 55 bushel. My no-till was 48. So in a finite game mentality, conventional trumps. But when you look at how much organic matter you're saving, and considering my limiting factor on my farm where I have decent rainfall is probably carbon dioxide, and I'm trying to keep that carbon sequestered, I think a lot of these reduced tillage systems, especially in the spring where we're seeing wetter springs and we're seeing more rain, and so to have tilled soil at the exact wrong moment versus planting a thick cover crop in the fall when we tend to have more consistent rainfall is a big thing. An idea I took away from Mr. Zimmer is he talks about pre-soybeans trying to suck every daggone nutrient out of that soil to prevent the weeds from growing. And so every acre on our farm that is going either into corn or is going into a tilled bean has three things growing on it. It has aerial seeded rye from the year prior, and I am frost seeding oats, and I am frost seeding medium red clover. And you're saying, Jared, you're insane. Why would you plant that legume when it's not going to create any N? Because that's short-sighted. See, if that system gets rained out, I can combine off that oats and that rye later, and I've got the clover growing, and I'm postured for a successful next year. And by the way, I would argue that you don't want, I think the good doctor yesterday was speaking on cover crops, you don't want a lot of thick rye going into corn, because if you don't till that, all right, we talk about that young green succulent rye versus that hard woody, the C to N that's a mile long, that ratio, and now you're going to try to grow corn when your bacteria is busy breaking down all that thick rye. Oats is a lot more pliable, and certainly medium red clover is got a wonderful C to N, and so let's get a diverse cover crop on ahead of time, and oh, by the way, that's my plan B. And again, I'm finding I would much rather have a little bit of rye holding the ground going into the winter and frost seed in the spring. I'm getting more cover crop growth versus trying to go into beans and corn and plant these mixes that grow for tens of hours before they freeze to death. And then the only other note I have is that Mighty Buffalo cultivator with those disc killers. You know, I'm not really terrified about being rained out from planting because I can do a plan B. What I'm always terrified is I plant and then the rain comes for 3 weeks and I can't till in time. And you can clean up, especially in corn, you can clean up some really terrible messes with a buffalo if you set it up right. So that's all I had on that topic.
I wanted to bring up too about harvest, because we had kind of an usually we don't have so much difficulty in harvesting. Maybe, I know that Tor and John have tried some things to get themselves out in the field that involved some lighting.
What's that? Are you talking about like the late night, the early morning frost drilling and all of that kind of stuff?
Oh.
Yeah, that's more Tor's arena, and we both.
Yeah, so, you know, as I was talking about trying to figure out ways to do more no-till, less soil disturbance, you know, I'm on some really challenging soils, and we grow a lot of spring wheat, and spring wheat likes to go in early. And so we heard about these farmers in Quebec, and I guess this is fairly standard practice up there. They go in and they do what's called frost planting, and maybe you guys out here are already doing it, but I hadn't heard of it before. I actually read about it in a really great book by a farmer in Vermont named Jack Laser, who's a good friend of mine. It's called The Organic Grain Grower, and I recommend that to everybody to read. It reads like a really nice novel, honestly, very conversational style. But in there, he talked about, he's right on the Quebec border, and I don't know if you've ever been up to Quebec, but it looks a lot like Iowa up there. It's flat, really nice soils, and the Quebec farmers have a real culture of growing small grains up there. And what I read about them doing was going up and no-tilling into about a half-inch or so of frozen ground in the middle of March, or up in Quebec, that's probably at the end of March. So last spring, or in mid-March, we went out and we waited till the ground had thawed, and we borrowed a 1590 John Deere no-till drill from my neighbor, because we didn't own one. And me and the guy I farm with, Dan Gladstone, we went out at about 2 in the morning when the ground was just right. And this was some of our wetter ground. And we sunk that drill into the ground and cruised across the field, and it had enough weight, and the discs were nice, that we cut through the frozen ground. And I was sitting on the back of the drill with a flashlight watching as he went across the field. And it was interesting, as we went across, the ground sort of fractured where it was frozen. It made a slot, and then the closing wheel couldn't really close it that well. And I thought, oh, this isn't going to really work. You could kind of see the seeds down in there. But what happened was, as the temperature went up during the day, I went back there, and the soil had puddled. The frozen soil had puddled and filled in the trench, and thus the seed was in there. And we had a fantastic crop of spring wheat. So I think little out of the box thinking that way, and obviously the Quebec farmers had already done it for us, but that allowed us to get our crop in really early, not till the soil. And we did no weed control on that. And I don't know if any of you grow a lot of spring wheat, but it can be a real weed control challenge. It was pretty well weed free. That's just an idea to throw out there. If anybody gets into trying that, it would work with oats too. I'd love to hear how you made out for it. We're going to try it again this year. So.
And would that also be in the fall with a wet harvest, to go out when the ground, overnight it's kind of frozen up, and then?
Well, obviously, yeah. 2 years ago, we didn't finish our soybean harvest. It was so wet harvest in New York. We were done in the middle of January. We went out and were combining in the snow. And the last field we did, we went to this roll-down organic cover crop with rolled down soybeans. We were working with Matt Ryan at Cornell and had a field of that. And the thing that I liked about it was that it was pretty weed free, and that I liked the soil being protected by the mat of rye. But the problem was that mat of rye prevented the soil from freezing earlier on, and we couldn't get on the field, and we lost most of those beans. So, pluses and minuses there. So by the time it froze, most of the beans were on the ground, and we were in the snow combining them. So.
Okay. Can you all speak to redundancy and its role in your operation, and whether that could be in your crop rotation or the equipment that you have or your marketing plans?
That's obviously a big question. I think obviously the first one is on the equipment side. I mean, we being a sizable operation, there used to be a lot of dairy cattle, so we have on-farm, 2 balers. That's kind of for us, and the amount of hay we make, that's the number one redundancy you need, because those tend to go down at the worst possible time and require technicians and all these sorts of things. We only have 1 combine right now, but I can really tell that that's probably going to change sooner than later. And my gut feeling is to go, I might regret this, but go a little bit older with that combine than newer. Just because, we have a 2388 case, and there's some crops in particular, the grain buckwheat, that might actually benefit from the older style combine. So there's pluses and minuses there, but obviously having that built in as best we can is critical. And then on the marketing side, obviously especially with the small grains, we shoot for food. where we can with distillery, feed, and seed, not necessarily in that order also in our heads. So we try to make sure that we have the most flexibility and marketing potential that we can. I mean, there's always going to be challenging crops. We had this is actually a plan B this year where we had a field of rye. It was too wet to go out and terminate it. The plan was to terminate it and plant soybeans, so we decided to just leave the rye and combine it. But because we had planted it on corn stalks, we had one crop of rye that was planted on plow down alfalfa, and that grew beautifully and had a vomitoxin right around 1 part per million, which is the limit for food grade. And with basically the same flowering date, the other rye, which we planted on corn stalks, which we didn't ever anticipate combining, it was just supposed to be a knockdown cover crop, that had a vomitoxin of 6. And because we also weren't prioritizing it as a food grade crop, it ended up being one of the later ones we combined, so the germ was bad. So we're sitting on, it was not a lot, probably a truckload of high DON, low germ, not very pretty rye, and that can be used for animal feed, but it's got to be blended back pretty good. So, there's always going to be situations where even your plan B might not necessarily have been the best idea. Maybe a soil building year and not even taking the grain would have been the better call at that point. Yeah, let these guys talk more on that.
So I'm scared to death of single points of failures. We have 2 of just about everything: tine weeder, cultivators, rotary hose, 2 combines, 2 corn heads, 2 bean heads, 1 pickup head. Can you guys guess which one I destroyed this summer harvesting oats? Now I have 3 of them. Redundancy is good. And yeah, because again, it's always with the climatic extremes, when it's time to go, we got to go. And so I can't be down for a day or 2 hoping to get the corn. So we even have two corn planters. In terms of cropping systems, I teach and mentor. My full-time job is I teach ROTC cadets how to be Army officers, and I always tell them, I don't care about your plan A. You can have the best plan A in the world. If you don't have a plan B, your plan sucks, because the only thing we know is that plan A is not going to work. And so every single field has a plan B. Now that plan B might be buckwheat, which is, if you can't grow buckwheat, that's a pretty easy one, But there's just times you say, hey, this is going to be a building year, which is we're going to take a failure down. We're going to avoid the weed seed production. I think Dr. Gruver talked about a failed bean experiment that turned into some really wonderful corn the next year. But have a second plan. A couple notes. This is actually from compliments of Paul Hoffman, my good friend. He talked about how we plant fairly heavy seeding. We've seen good luck with that. And for example, soybeans on our conventional, we're looking at about 180 to 190,000 population, and for our tillage, 220. But what we're getting at is knowing that if we have to do some more aggressive cultivations to make the system work, looking at that desired final end state for seed count, about 100,000. So again, even just when you plant and how you plant and what variety you plant, that idea that this might not go the way you want it. But again, especially when we have a 2 or 3 day window to get that planting done, or a 2 to 3 day window to get that timely harvest done, we need to have redundancy equipment. The final thing I really, really like where I'm at, the swather, the only crop I direct combine is my soybean crop. Everything else we swath. And so if I've got a small grain and it's full of ragweed or whatever that's about to make viable seed, I can knock that down with that swather and let it lay, and I can prevent that nasty annual weed from going to seed. And I can still, now I'm going to have some loss. You let a windrow of rye or oats sit for 2-3 weeks, you will have loss. And you're going to know right where it's at, because there's going to be a pretty green spot. That windrow is going to grow up, and that's where all those seeds fell. But I'd rather have that and have a little less yield than have tens of thousands of seeds per, whatever square foot go to seed in the form of ragweed or pigweed or whatever.
I don't know if I can add a whole lot to that. That was a good list of redundancy stuff, and I would ditto everything that they said. One thing that we do is, and this isn't certainly every operation is going to have different circumstance, but my operation is spread out over 25 miles. So we've got fields all over creation and different microclimates and whatnot. So I try to do redundancies in terms of planting critical crops like our food grade wheats and spread them out over the area in case there's a hailstorm, or, you know, these thunderstorms sometimes can be very localized. So by, you know, casting your crops across a big area, some of the same crops, you know, a few times that's really worked out, so that we've gotten, one crop has gotten destroyed and another crop has made food grade. And that same philosophy, and I'll talk about this later, has gone down into our flour milling business, where we've, you know, spread out the number of growers that we work with across New York State, because the climate and where the storms hit, or different soil types or elevations, you know, all these things can really change the quality of a crop. So, I mean, it's, I guess, a risk management strategy, which could have gone into the first question about resilience, but it's also a redundancy question of planting the same thing in different areas. So, I think that covered it, yeah.
Okay, so can my fearless Mike people in the back? So we thought maybe on those two questions, those kind of topics of resiliency and being prepared with numerous plans. If the first one doesn't work, because it probably won't, then what do you got coming up next? Anyone have any comments on that?
Any other strategies from the audience, or?
You're all flummoxed by how many plans you have to have? Oh, there's one over here.
This would be a question for all of you, but I'm just, I guess, curious specifically to climate change in your crop rotations. Are there things that you've done on your farm for crop rotation with significant rainfall, later springs, earlier falls, all of this, that you've had to feel like you've made permanent adjustments to your crop rotations to deal with what we might see as like a new normal? I don't know if that's a possible question to answer yet, but I'd certainly be interested to hear your thoughts on it.
So on some of our land that's chronically wet, I told Mr. Zimmer that he coined this first, said it first, but it was my own independent idea. We've gone away from soybeans in there. We've just had too many. So we're doing a corn rye rotation, and we're trying to no-till as much as possible on some of our wetter lands, and also some of our more geographically, the ones that are harder for me to get to. And then also the ability to wrap baleage for those that still have a forage in it. It's fun to make dry hay. I do it once every 6 years, whether I need to or not. But it does, and it's not, you know, we have this touchscreen wireless handheld device that you all have one of, and it's got a weather app on, and it's no more fun than you see 4 days of sun. It's not gonna rain, and it's literally raining on you as you cut hay. So I would say those are two permanent C's, is any type of tillage intensive practice, what's your plan B, and that might mean eliminating a crop. And then the second thing is if you're still doing forages, and we still have those antique concrete cylinder things that we blast stuff into called the silo, and so we make a lot more silage than we do dry hay this year, or as kind of the new normal.
The only thing I would add there is I hesitate to declare anything a permanent change at this point, just because I feel like, I thought what Fred said yesterday about there's a difference between basically anticipating the fact that things are going to change and predicting the future. And I think having that mindset of things are changing, we don't exactly know how, but to get back to the resilience piece, like to try to build enough flexibility in your system so that if it's a wet year, it's a dry year, you have an ability, and you have, you know, like I've modeled a lot of what we do on our farm after Torres Farm and other farms like it, but we have a 6 to 8 year grain rotation, and it's a ton of work. It spreads out all the work over the course of the year. You don't have these concentrated, boom and bust cycles. You're just running all the time, but it allows us to probably farm more acres with less bodies, and it also, when one crop gets destroyed by a hailstorm, there might be another crop that doesn't get damaged so badly. So that diversity is kind of like, in a little bit of a way, of built-in crop insurance, especially when most of those crops are uninsurable anyway, from a crop insurance perspective. The other part is the infrastructure of grain drying and storage, obviously. I think when you're especially talking about small grains, timely harvest and almost pre-timely harvest, if you can get out, I think you said in your talk yesterday, you've brought in wheat at 22% moisture. If you have the ability to dry that down with either a batch dryer, or on our farm we have a regular continuous flow dryer, but we put a bucket elevator on the discharge end of it so that we can actually lower the plenum temperature and recirculate grain back through the continuous flow dryer, which lets us run it a little bit more like a batch dryer. So if you're interested in saving seed, or you're looking for a food grade market where you can't run the high temperatures that you would traditionally if you're drying corn, and then having the bins to put grain in, having the swather to be able to knock it down, all of those tools, especially with summer harvest, are really indispensable, I think.
I have a question if anyone's doing this as a strategy, or if any of the seed folks want to weigh in. Is anyone doing anything different with spreading out variety selection or maturity dates of corn or soybean to try to add resilience or kind of buffer against not knowing what's coming in the spring or the fall?
I laughed a little bit because I can't plant any shorter maturity crops. They don't make them.
That's true. That's true. I know there's trade-offs there with, I think we've heard about, the trade-offs of, optimizing yield in the short term versus building resilience and reducing risk in the long term. And I just wonder how much, looking at just, I think there's some really good genetics with some of the shorter season hybrids now. And Joel talked a little bit about, spreading out planting dates so that you're not having to do different weeding operations in the field all at the same time, if that's another option for just kind of buffering against uncertain harvest weather.
Yeah, I would say the balancing act that creates is that the more variables you have in the field, the more segregation you need post-harvest to handle the variability you might have at harvest time. I know that we grow a bunch of different varieties of stuff, way more than we should, and that ends up being sort of the issue. Is like you spread it out enough, it's a good hedge. It's a good hedge, but if you have to mix it all up again in the bin, it might not be the best strategy. So that's always, you have to balance that with your infrastructure and what you're able to do on that side.
I hadn't thought of that. It's a great point. With storage and drying and just keeping the integrity of the varieties.
Yeah, we grew this wheat variety for the Blue Hill restaurant, which is down by the city, and the chef there is into these offbeat wheats, and it was a variety called Skagit 1109. It was out of Steve Jones's program out at Washington State, and this is what he wanted me to grow, so I got it and grew it, and it was actually a polyculture of about 6 different wheats, including club wheat. I don't know if you've all seen club wheat, which is some pretty interesting stuff. And I sort of like the diversity there, but there is also, to speak to what John said, there was a problem with some of that wheat had gotten mature and some of it wasn't there yet. I think what you said there is, as using different varieties, you can vary the time at which they head out. So if you've got rainstorm or wet weather there, you may not get fusarium, or we try to do that with our buckwheat planting in terms of, if you're putting in 300 acres of buckwheat, we sort of stagger it to, if we get a real hot spell on some of it where we might get really bad seed blasting, and get low yields there, the other crop might be a week later when the weather's a little cooler and get a better seed set. So I think that's an excellent strategy. The Skagit 1109, that we planted it the year that was the biggest drought Tompkins County has ever seen since, I think, 1840 or something, when they started taking weather data. So it actually did great because there was no rain. But the next time we planted it in a typical I'm imagining Wisconsin in the upper Midwest is like New York, where it's humid and rains all the time, and it sucks for growing wheat a lot of the time. It was a total disaster. I mean, we lost the crop. So those are can be pluses and minuses depending on how you deploy them. So.
Okay, we'll go to the next question. What are the 2 to 3 best practices or pieces of advice you wish you'd known when you started farming in an organic or regenerative manner? So we do have a lot of transitioning to organic farmers in the audience. So what do you wish you knew that, we learned from your mistakes?
Yeah, I mean, I've made so many mistakes, I just had to pick a few. And I wish I knew a lot more. I always wish I knew a lot more than I do. I mean, one thing we really screwed up in the beginning was when we were starting to grow corn organically, was the mentality of more is better in terms of putting on manure. And, I started noticing on the fields where I was applying a lot of chicken manure, my weeds were getting worse and worse. And, I've been part of a long-term organic systems trial at Cornell University that they've, I think, had this going for almost 15 years, and there's all different types of management that are all run in concurrent trials. And what they realized was, and I was really interested to listen to Gary Zimmer yesterday, who was recommending really high phosphorus levels. And the research that I was involved with Cornell's, what we found was that high phosphorus levels bring on a lot more weeds and don't necessarily give you more yield. Where we had our very high input, where we were putting lots of chicken manure on the corn, the yield was a little higher, but the weed biomass was much, much, much higher than the little bit lower groups. And I'm not sure why that could be just a New York thing. Obviously, the high phosphorus levels are working out here in the Midwest. But it didn't work for me, and I would just maybe approach that with caution. That was something that I stopped doing. We started, instead of applying it, feeding the cover crop with the manure and then using the cover crop to feed the corn, And the other mistake I was making was putting the dried layer manure on right ahead of corn planting, where that manure was worked right into the top few inches, and the phosphorus and nitrogen was stimulating a lot of weeds. I mean, that was a mistake too. So now we put it on in the fall on a cover crop, clover or something, and then we've had much better luck controlling weeds in our corn. Other thing I made a big mistake on was when I was first getting into organic grain farming, I was working another job teaching diesel mechanics at the Votech school, and just farming at night and on the weekends. So my crop rotation was basically 2 small grains. And for some reason, I didn't realize that was going to be a big problem in terms of disease, and then ended up with all sorts of really big problems with my crops. And now I'm really careful about designing a rotation with break crops in it, and designing it so that we've never got 2 grasses in a row. And that's been a game changer for me. Another mistake I made was I was always a big seed saver. When I got started, I rented 15 acres of land, and I grew rye, and I bought a little Vacaway seed cleaner for $50 at an auction, and I started cleaning rye seed in my barn, and I've sort of continued on that way. And what I didn't think about was the possibility of getting different weeds that were going to be a problem in that seed, and then spreading that as my farm got bigger, spreading that across my farm and creating a huge problem for myself, and specifically with wild radish. I don't know if that's a big weed out here or not, but it can be a problem in New York, and I didn't notice it in the seed, particularly my oat seed, and then I was planting these oats in different fields and also planting that weed in there with these oat seeds. I thought I was saving myself money by saving my own seed, but I was creating a really big problem for myself later on. So I would just, any of you seed savers there, get to know your weed seeds really well and be very observant. And I think I wasn't being observant and or knowing what was there. So those are just 3 of a multitude of foo bars I did.
Speaking as, I don't know how many aspiring farmers there are in the room, but Hallie and I came into farming I grew up partly on a farm, but spent most of my upbringing in the 20s in cities, Milwaukee and New York mainly. When we came back, the idea was to take over the family farm, and long story short, the family politics were toxic, and we made the decision at the time to walk away from that and look for a job on a farm. And we lucked into working with Paul, who at 62 was fully cognizant of the amount of knowledge that he had accumulated in his brain over 40 years and how he wanted to make sure that he could pass that on to somebody. And I think in a lot of ways that's the biggest thing. We lucked into that. That was a really tough decision at the time, and I don't think we realized the opportunity we had at the time. I was jumping from my family farm, which was 160 acres, to 800-900 acres of organic grain, like a 2-fold increase in tractor horsepower, all that kind of stuff. So I was completely overwhelmed, but landing in a place where you're not starting from a position of debt right off the bat, like step 1 is not buy a farm. Step 1 is glom on to people that know a heck of a lot more than you and work on their farms. And the opportunity might not be on that farm, but it'll lead you down your path. You come to conferences like this, and you'll get, woven into a fabric of a community. And I think that's really a much better way to have a successful foundation in farming, especially if you're not necessarily coming from a position of inheriting the family farm. So that's really the main thing. The other ones are a lot of what Tor said, like understanding when you zig, when you implement another strategy, like going from, a corn, bean, oat, hay rotation to, starting to do more winter wheat and starting to do buckwheat and these other grains. If it's obvious at this point, you do a lot more cool season grasses. The weeds that are going to emerge are the ones that thrive in cool season grasses. So like 2019, we had tremendous quackgrass flare-ups. That wasn't on my radar, it wasn't on Paul's radar, but just always being attentive and mindful and scouting all the time to know whatever decision you make, there's going to be an equal and opposite reaction somewhere out in your field. And to be looking for that ahead of time.
So a couple strategic and a couple tactical. So if you're conventional looking at organic, what you want is the recipe. When do I till? What variety do I plant? What tillage tools do I need? And the way a lot of folks think about conventional, there is no recipe. If someone actually wants to sell you a recipe, I would turn around and I wouldn't walk, I would run. All right, there isn't a recipe, but the pioneers in the 80s and 90s, Jack and Klaus and Gary, they had to go back and look at textbooks from the 20s and 30s to start to figure this thing out. And they did a lot of wonderful work. It is now Year of Our Lord 2020. There are dozens of amazing books and resources. YouTube alone has everything you need to know, so you do not have to reinvent the wheel. Whatever crop you're growing, there is a way to grow it regeneratively, organically, and probably somebody's already done it and they'll figure it out. And there's a lot of wonderful mentors here in this room and elsewhere. So remember that, and I would also, it kind of ties into the debt load. There's as much witchcraft in this method of farming as anywhere else. before you go and spend tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars on a widget or a certain piece of equipment that's going to rust, rot, or depreciate because it doesn't work on your farm, all right, before you buy into some fertilizer regimen that promises to eliminate all your weeds, start small, think big, scale fast. I would never advocate trying a brand new fertilizer on half or three-quarters of your acres, because more farmers will buy themselves expensive problems and expensive solutions. Klaus Martins told me that 2 years ago. A couple of tactical ideas. I don't know when it's going to rain in the spring, and I don't know when it's going to be dry, but it's going to freeze up by the polar bears where I live. So I frost seed a lot of my cover crops, and I've had really good luck with that. That 3-point herd seeder I have and that GPS on that little 4-cylinder tractor has paid for itself multiple times over. I want something green and growing. I don't know if you guys saw when Dr. Groover said that today, I saw a bunch of people taking notes. We had it all upside down. You don't build organic matter by putting straw and corn residue in. You have green, living plants photosynthesizing well and creating root exit, and that's how you build organic matter. And if I don't get out there and frost seed, it's going to be too wet. The other thing, things that are easy to say, hard to do, the best thing you can do, whenever your conventional neighbors start to plant, take your spouse and get the heck out of the county. Go somewhere else on a nice vacation. Head to Stillwater or Dubuque or something. Go get away. It's so easy to say delay planting, but then you watch all your conventional neighbors going and you get itchy, and it's time to go because they're going. And I would much rather plant 3 weeks late than 5 days early. Take your time, get the seed in the ground at the right time when the weather, and then finally, when the weather is good, go and keep that tractor. Semi drivers used to say the best way to make a good time in a semi is to keep the left door closed. Keep those wheels a turning, and when that one breaks down, park it, hook on the other one, and keep going, because you have no guarantee that tomorrow. So when that field's fit to plant, don't shut her down. Hire whoever you have to hire, do whatever you have to do to get that seed in the ground, and then Gary McDonald will tell you now you've got a bunch of babies and they have poopy diapers called rotary hoeing and tine weeding and cultivating, and when you have time to do those, get after it.
All right, we'll do another question and then we'll go around to the group. What do you see as the greatest opportunity in the coming decade in organic farming? And what do you see as the greatest challenge?
Let's see. I think one of the things that was really inspiring to me when I came here, and Thursday night there was a really great no-till session. I think trying to figure out the no-till aspect of organic farming. I think there's way too much tillage, and it seems like the more I learn about tillage, the worse I feel when I go out there with my tillage tools. I think there's a really good opportunity. It seemed like a lot of the guys I met here, I met these really great guys from Pennsylvania who were no-tilling down there and are, going to come into organic agriculture. I think there's a really great opportunity for farmers that maybe are struggling with the conventional system for whatever reason that is, to come in and start learning about organic. But there's also a really good opportunity for us from organic farmers to learn from them, because there's a lot of things they know about cover crops and no-tilling that we can use as well to help our operations. I think that this isn't a conventional organic divide, like a red state, blue state, or however you want to put it. I think we're all in this thing together, and we all need to learn from each other, and we all need to look at each other as farmers and not organic farmers or conventional farmers, whichever one you choose. I think there's a lot there to learn, and I get a lot of students from Cornell University because I'm so close. They come and there's a class where they go out and they look at a whole bunch of different kinds of farms, and I'm the organic grain farm that they come and look at, and they go look at a conventional grain farm. And I think a lot of those kids think, oh, organic farm, this is, totally sustainable and absolutely groovy, and all of this is super wonderful. And I think all of us who've been doing this for a long time realize there's a lot of problems in organic agriculture that we need to figure out. And I think I always tell them, we need to be thinking down the road about a type of agriculture that maybe is some mix of organic and conventional, if we can both think about pieces of our operations that really work. You know, I know in my operation, I've got this big bare fallow period where I control perennial weeds. Well, what about if we created a system where maybe somebody at a university would look at that and say, maybe spraying that once out of every 10 years is better for the environment than all that tillage and better for greenhouse gas emissions. And we start looking at agriculture as a way to mitigate climate change and look at maybe some of the practices we're doing at organic farmers and rethink those. So I think there's opportunities for organic farmers and conventional farmers to get together and start thinking about, you know, farming and what we're doing to our planet and our communities, and learn from each other. And that's encouraging to me. You know, I think another challenge is that there's been a lot of ingress of I don't know what I want to call this, but interests that have only money in their eyeballs when they're looking at organic farming. And I think this can be a dangerous thing. I mean, Joel was talking about a rotation where you went from corn to corn to corn to corn. And I think what we have to realize is that if we want that extra money from the consumer, when that consumer is out there and they're buying it, they are voting for our philosophy as farming. And if they find out the way they found out with the chicken industry, that some of these practices are not healthy for the animals or for us, too many antibiotics, too crowded, inhumane, all these things, if they start finding out that we're kind of cheating on the rules, if there's a lot of fraud, we're going to lose that price premium. So we have to realize that, you know, when we're doing this, the consumer is out there paying extra, thinking that we're doing the right thing. And so in your gut, if you have something you're doing that you don't really feel is as sustainable as it could be, or you're cheating the system a little bit, I think we really have to check ourselves and watch out what we're doing, so that the consumer has confidence. You know, I mean, I know in New York we've got a lot of these small dairy farms, Amish dairy farms, who really graze their cattle and all these, and I read about these gigantic herds of down in the Southwest where they've got these things penned in and they don't really follow the letter of the grazing rule. When people start finding out about that's going to be a big problem. So we need to be righteous when we farm organically, I think.
I don't know how far off the rails to go here, but and this is piggybacking on Tor. Obviously, there's pretty remarkable, consistent increasing consumer demand for organic. The challenge is, how do we grow it in a way that doesn't result in, say, okay, a farmer doesn't get 4 cents for a box of Cheerios, they get 7. And instead of, you know, not picking on Cheetos, but, you know, conventional junk food to organic junk food, like we learned with Fred yesterday, tremendous public health problems. And I don't personally trust top-down money to actually implement and provide the consumers what they want, unless farmers can, in the way that Organic Valley did a couple of decades ago, really take control of the processing side as well and start to close that gap between the ground that the grain is grown on and where the animals are grazed and the actual food that people eat. Obviously, it's incredibly utopian, and realistically, you know, those sorts of changes require an incredible amount of entrepreneurial spirit among farmers, and we've got the deck stacked against us. But I don't think necessarily that we're going to solve the problems and have the revolutionary change we need just by having, you know, General Mills embrace organics and start buying truckloads of it. I think that's a half measure. And if that's the opportunity in front of us now, obviously it behooves us to take advantage of it. But I think we need to be thinking bigger than that in the long term.
So, greatest challenge outside of weather would be I would not pray at the altar of any one commodity. We've seen organic wheat come down a little bit, organic soy, and if you think $8 to $10 organic corn is the normal look in 10 years out, it's probably not. We tend to always overproduce and drive our own price down. We're our own enemy. But what I am excited and terrified about is, as I understand it, Mr. Dan Kittredge is going to have a little device coming out in the next 2 to 3 years that measures nutrient density right here, right now. And here's why that's awesome. That's awesome because I can walk out into that field and I can take an immediate test of that leaf, an old leaf and a new leaf. I don't have to do a sap analysis. I don't do a tissue analysis. I don't do a soil analysis. And I can say, hey, I have a functional manganese deficiency. Or during cell division, I don't have enough calcium. Or during cell expansion, I don't have enough potassium, and I can apply potassium sulfate or gypsum or a manganese foliar, and I can address that right on the spot. And that is going to be awesome. And it's going to be terrifying because when that comes out, our consumers are going to be able to go in that store and they're going to be able to scan the fruit and the food that we make, and they're going to look. And if you give them 2 tomatoes and 1 tomato is certified organic, but it's incredibly low in secondary metabolites and minerals, and the other one was produced on a farm that's not certified organic, but it's high quality, high produce, what do you think they're going to buy, especially if the organic one's more expensive? I was talking to Mark about this, Mark Dudla, but I do think in the next 12 years, whenever that tool comes, plus about a decade, there's going to be a label, and it might be tied to organic, it might not, and that label is this. This fruit, this thing you're about to eat, has a bare minimum level of quality. There's absolutely no synthetic residue. Doesn't mean it never saw a herbicide or a pesticide, but it's not in the food, and it was grown on a farm that's sustainable or regenerative as by a certain testing of organic matter, and that you have to either be building organic matter or staying the same. And I hope organics is part of that train, because there's a lot of, if you go ahead and plow, dig, and disc 12 times a year on every crop to keep your organic label and keep the weeds down, you ain't going to make the cut, and that tool is going to test it out. That's what I'm excited and terrified about.
Okay, so from the audience, any best practices or advice for new people as well as opportunities and challenges? Okay, and I need my little microphone elves out there. Harry's got a question up here. Harry, raise your hand again to show.
Let's do this one first because Annie's
Okay,
closer,
yeah.
and then move forward.
This isn't along those lines, but I was wondering what tips you have for spring-seeded small grains, specifically for avoiding weeds, like fertilizers, tillage. Frost seeding sounds cool. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do that, but.
I mean, the number one thing is early planting. And then, there's some other techniques. I'll talk about that in the talk I do after lunch. Go over some specific things that we do to keep weeds down. Do you got anything to add to that? So, yeah.
John mentioned tine weeder also. Go ahead, Harry.
Well, since we sort of launched into the future there on that last question, do any of you have any thoughts about the perennialization of agriculture, where we shift from the annual crops, the primary grains, to annual crops? And I know Kernza has been talked about, but there are other sorghums and going back to those. Do you see in the next decade on your farms an embrace of perennials? And then agroforestry is another thing, or silvopasture and animals.
I think Mark Shepard's work in silvopastures is phenomenal. I'll be visiting his farm this summer, and we're probably going to do that on some of our challenged acres. I say again that I really do believe that on a lot of operations, you're going to see livestock coming back. As I understand it, people smarter than me have told me that if you bring on beef feeders onto an intensely so the ground can be corn or beans or it can be beef, that rotationally grazing beef, even if you buy at market prices and you sell, this isn't selling to a niche market that's paying you an organic premium, you can make more profit per acre. It's just a lot harder and it's a lot less fun in terms of less fishing. But I think that as these climatic extremes continue, farmer, you fail like trying to grow a corn crop 8 years in a row because of climate extremes. At some point, you're going to say, I've got to do something else. So I think the perennialization, whether that's pasture that's being fed to a critter, or if that's more of a perennial crop, but most farmers want to do right by their land, and most aren't even looking for the profit, right? They're looking to make enough money to feed their family. And so if that means that I have to grow a lower yielding perennial crop, but I don't see all of my topsoil washing down the hill, they'll make that hit just because they care more about the soil health than making 3 cents more an acre.
I think we planted about 9 acres of kerns on the farm this last fall, and I put it specifically on a steep upland field that was directly uphill from an existing pasture. It was a field that I thought I was going to graze anyway. I wanted to seed it down. Valentine approached us as part of a SARE project to do interseeding of different legumes with kernza. And without cattle, I don't think I would plant it right now. If I were doing it on grain alone, I think in the current moment, I think it's great for people to experiment with it on small acres and help the Land Institute and help the land grants really try to improve it as quick as we can with that eye on the future. But in the meantime, I think that trying to find a way to have a balance of annual and perennial crops, legumes and grains and ruminants within the same farm ecosystem is the best way I can figure right now that I can try to at least start along that path.
Yeah, we put kernza in too and didn't have a whole lot of luck with it, and I think that also could be a lot of, I didn't know what I was doing when I put it in, didn't get it in right at the right time. And this stuff is really difficult to combine, difficult to clean. We were just part of a trial for farms in New York just to see how it would do in New York. The other thing they gave me that I planted along with it, next to it, was a perennial rye. I don't know, is there anybody out there that's grown perennial rye? Anybody ever seen it? I think it was out of Canada. Somehow Cornell University got some. I planted it. And that actually did really, really, really well. I mean, it didn't yield huge amounts, but the berries were big. It threshed nice. I mean, it looked almost like the rye you're used to seeing. The second year, it yielded about half of that. And then I think the third year, I would probably either make hay out of it or plow it up, because the yield dropped pretty precipitously. But with some breeding, I think that holds some promise. I mean, even if you can eliminate 1 year of tillage and get 2 crops off of it, if you don't have anything really it's already established and you really just need to run the combine over it, then that's great. And we got for what we did harvest, we sent it down to a distillery in Brooklyn, and they made some really awesome whiskey out of it. And so that was something nice too. And so, the other thing is all these perennial crops they were talking about, long root ale. People are looking for these, and there's, even if they don't yield well or aren't something big now, all these niche industries, distilleries, breweries are looking for something interesting and something new to add to their line of beer. It's getting very competitive, so that if you can do some of this, I think they're pretty easily marketable as well.
Since I have the microphone, I just throwing this out there more as just a philosophizing versus making any statement. But when we talk about perennial, we talked a little bit about this on Thursday, just with, there's 5 soil health principles, and a lot of times in organic, and I totally agree, Tor. I mean, I think it's absolutely essential moving into the future that we recognize where we still need to make progress in organic, not only with upholding integrity and the intention of the organic standards, but continually working as a community to really look at where our deficits are, including tillage. But with perennialization, really, what are our goals in agriculture, and where are our challenges? And certainly tillage is one of them. But if we're looking at creating an ecological system, certainly we just heard Matt talk about prairies. limiting soil disturbance is one element, but I worry with these perennial crops, where is the diversity? Where is the support of pollinators? Where is the support of beneficials? Is having a monoculture of perennial kernza on the landscape any better than having continuous corn on the landscape? It's still a monoculture. Is that really supporting the goals of what we're trying to build with our agricultural systems? And where are those trade-offs? Are we prioritizing the perennialization over our biodiversity, over feeding the soil microbes with a diverse rhizosphere? And I just don't want that to get lost. And not to say that we shouldn't be talking about perennialization or working towards that, but should we look at creating perennial crops that also integrate these other goals or reaching of essentially an ecological system that ideally mimics nature?
That's actually that's a really good point. I mean, when I was growing it, I was thinking of those exact same things and thinking what crops could grow as a companion with this kernza, maybe a ladino clover or something like that, where we could get species that grew a little bit lower than it growing in companion with it, and you know, looking at, I mean, the kernza comes out of, I think, gamma grass, which is a tall grass prairie thing, and I don't know, you know, what those, how diverse that was, but looking more at those systems and how to mimic that and still get a decent crop off of it, I think that's an excellent point.
And since I have the microphone, I'll make one of them, because I thought this was so cool. I put this on social media the other day. I was in one of the cafeterias here on campus, and I was buying a snack, and there were 3 young women behind the counter, working the counter. And one of them was talking, she was making a coffee, and she said, you know, I decided, I'm thinking about moving away from almond milk. I guess she was putting almond milk in her coffee, because almond milk, the amount of water it takes to produce a gallon of almond milk. And this was just a conversation behind the counter. The 3 women were engaged in this conversation of making food choices because of how their food was produced. And one of the young women actually said, you know, if we don't make our voices heard with our purchasing, with how we're purchasing, then nothing's going to change. And young people are talking about this. This was just a casual conversation, and other people in the cafeteria started engaging in it. But it gives me a lot of hope, but also, again, is, you know, looking at where we're moving to with farming and responding to where the next generation is wanting and prioritizing. It was just so cool to actually see that unfold in front of me happening, that they really are talking about this. They're paying attention.
I got a question real quick to the group. Is there any tool or procedure that you can't live without that you have, or is there one that you'd really like to have? That's a brain fryer, right?
Are you paying the hand weeding crew that's going to come in? Because then I don't need any tool. If you're doing any type of conventional tillage, the rotary hoe, a well-maintained rotary hoe and blind cultivation. Klaus Martens has published a lot of free articles on this. Dr. Groover's put a lot of stuff on Ag Talk. You can read about it. A well-timed rotary hoe, especially if you've got a cross with white-haired weeds, is worth about 2 row crop cultivations. And then I am so excited to watch Gary McDonald's videos. Gary McDonald, I went down, it was worth the trip, the 14-hour round trip. I watched him cultivate on an open station John Deere 2940, some modern technology, and an old beat up international cultivator. And he did, but whatever tool you have, understanding how to make that work. So talking conventional row crop, I think those are 2 invaluable tools in good maintenance, knowing how to use them. Of course, we're striving to get to where the fact that we're not having that many conventionally tilled crops, but when I was overseas last year, I read a stack of books about like that, and I could not find, outside of a rotational pasture or outside of a very small garden setting, a true certified organic 100% continuous no-till system. Whether you're talking Rodale or a research institute, you either have to spray or you have to have some level of tillage. So if you're going to do that thoughtful disturbance of the soil, whatever tools you have, knowing how to use it. I don't think that's the answer you're looking for, but that's what I would have to say.
I think the On our farm, I mean, because we do a lot of legumes and we do a lot of small grains, and we have such sensitive slope ground, I think the tools that in a lot of ways, they don't get very much credit at all, but air seeders that are useful for seeding legumes. Like we have a Gandy on a McFarland 16 bar harrow, and then we have an air seeder on our tine weeder. And between the two of those, the opportunities to get, and we've broadcast rye that way in our no-till system to try to get away from the crowding that happens in rows. We use it for cover crops and all. I'm trying to think of something that's not just going to be a typical answer. But I think those tools are incredibly versatile, especially when mounted onto weed control equipment and light tillage equipment, because it's limiting passes and it's giving you a ton of flexibility with what you can do.
I would say the one tool on our farm that I wouldn't get rid of was buckwheat. That plant is amazing, and it's been a game changer for us in terms of controlling perennial weeds, which are always going to start to come in on your farm. So in terms of weed control, you know, good crop rotation and having buckwheat in your rotation for us on my place, because I do have a lot of perennial weed problems. We got a lot of bindweed, a lot of quackgrass, a lot of thistle, horse nettle. Without that, I think I would get slowly overrun by those perennial weeds. So in terms of weed control, it's an important part of what we do.
Sets Dr. Gruber was communicating with me. If you don't have a GPS system on your planting tractor, can you live without it? Yes. But if you can plant your row straight, even if you don't do any of the follow-on passes, Dr. G said that to me a couple years ago, and it's absolutely true. So if you're still planting the old, hoping, aim at a tree in the far distance and hope the row turns out straight, and then you get back and you wonder who the drunk guy who planted the crooked row was, man, that is a wise investment. And if my GPS shuts down, I call the repair man and sit there and wait for him versus keep on it going, because I'd rather have that up and working. So.
That's why I can never cultivate my corn very well, obviously.
Okay, so this will probably be the last question. So I'm going to ask for one item from each of you, either a belief or practice that you used when you first started getting into organic that you no longer do, or one that you kind of poo-pooed and didn't really want to do, but now you feel like, oh, this is so important to me.
So I got a little backstory here, a little peek behind the curtains. We all met by a telecon a couple weeks ago, and we said, well, let's have some nice, easy lobbing softballs to answer in case, you know, just to get it kicked off. And so we're all going to write a few questions and submit them. So I put together like 9 of them and sent them off, and these 2 fine gentlemen said, yep, those look good, those will be the questions we're going to answer. And now I had the problem, right, because I wrote a bunch of questions and now I have to answer them. One thing, we all would love to have that pristine field, that pristine weed-free field with green, wonderful growing crops. You do this long enough, you get kind of weirded out when you see a freshly sprayed field and you're like, there's only one thing growing in there. You quickly learn to, I don't like the phrase weed control. It is weed management. On our farm we have different, and whether it's a perennial, there are certain weeds like certain types of pigweed and common ragweed and also lamb's quarter. There are billions of seeds, of those seeds in my soil. I am not going to eradicate them, and I'm not going to try, and it doesn't really impact yield. And then we still hand pull every giant ragweed because Mr. Zimmer said yesterday, you do that for a couple decades, it'll eventually go away, and you don't want it back. So transitioning from, remember, symptoms and problems. A weed is a symptom. It is not the problem. You have done something, or the weather's done something, but probably you, and you've created a condition for that weed to grow. Do not try to fix the symptom, okay? What is the problem? Mr. Klaus Martins tells a wonderful story about how he couldn't figure out why he had so much wild mustard in his oats, and yet his edible dry beans were dying because the roots were so bad. And he worked with a researcher at, I believe it was Cornell, and found out that he started planting mustard, frost-eating mustard into corn, and that took care of it. That wild mustard was growing because he had a rotation that had no brassicas in it. And so try to keep something growing in your soil, but look, what is Mother Nature telling you when she is growing that weed? There is a message. Listen.
I don't like the answers I'd written down after this conversation. Well, I mean, they're okay. They're just sort of not, they're too far in left field about, handling grain and storage and marketing and all the things that are, had I known how much work all that was going to be, I might have approached farming slightly differently. Probably not. I probably still would have plunged headlong into it, but it's that stuff when you do, and we haven't talked too much about this, but if you're interested in going down a direct marketing path, and there's no way to predict it, but try to have an appreciation for the amount of work that goes into all that, everything that comes after the combine. Like, combine is the middle of the journey, not the end, by any means, especially if you're dealing with customers that want grain metered out over the course of a year and they want it in the same condition it was 3 months after you combined it and 12 months after you combine it, when you've had a whole nother summer for bugs to try to gain a foothold in the bin. So those are, I mean, those sorts of things. And then also understanding, obviously when you start out, you start thinking about rotation in this way of like, oh, if I can just crack this code, and you've got this perfect system, but really you have a backbone that's constantly shifting, and then having that series of sort of, and it's not even that the plan B, C, and D are written down, but to just always go in with the mindset of giving yourself that flexibility to be able to make different decisions through the course of the year. That's something that I didn't have early on, and I've, through a lot of failures, come to embrace.
I'd say one thing that I used to believe that I don't believe now is that I'm only working if I'm out on the farm with my hands dirty. And what I found is that time spent in the office on financial management or marketing or planning is maybe more important than what I do when I go out there and I'm working in the shop or combining a crop or whatever, and to allow myself the time to do that, I think has paid off in making my farm a better farm than it would have been if I was just concentrating on the day-to-day. So, I try to, when I'm in the office and maybe it's a nice day, but I've got stuff to do or customers to talk to, I try to step back and do that, and that, I think, was a mistake I made early on. And the other thing is, and I said this already, I really, I came into this from conventional farming mentality, and the more fertilizer is better thing, I had a hard time getting that out of my noggin, and I've got some fields that we over-fertilize with chicken manure where they're so weedy now that we can't really grow row crops in there anymore. And that was a big mistake that I thought that was good, and now I really just fertilize enough for the crop and make sure that in my rotation I've got heavy feeders and light feeders in a mix, and I've got fields that I really screwed up, so that would be my other thing that I no longer believe more is better.
Does anyone have a comment on that? Their own thing that they really thought had to be done, and now they have found out that maybe that wasn't the best thing? Any comments? I don't see any hands. Well, we are 1 minute before noon. I don't know if any of you have something to say.
I think John should give a closing statement.
So
Summarize this for us.
I wish we had more time to have an open conversation, honestly. It'd be really great to be, I don't want to talk anymore. I want to hear everybody out here and their thoughts. I feel like we just threw a lot of stuff at the wall. Now we got to scrape it off, so.
Well, I would add one thing to what Tor said, and of course it's a somewhat shameless promotion, but also going to conferences and talking to other farmers, taking the time to visit other farmers, talk to the seed dealers, what kind of varieties are they, characteristics are they building in, talk to the marketers, what does the market want, all of that is important too, not just, your time out there in the field.
And an ad for the O-Grain listserv, Harriet.
Oh, the listserv, the O-Grain Compass with financials. I mean, there's a lot of tools out there that don't involve steel and pushing through soil. Go ahead, Jared.
I did want to say this. If you're not going to read a single book, if you're not going to download a single free SARE PDF, these are about $50. They're Bluetooth headphones. Now, if you still do Open Station, you can get for $50 the Bluetooth ones that cover and protect your ears. If you do nothing else when you're doing your spring tillage, your spring work, the Regenerative Agriculture podcast, the Acres USA Tractor Time podcast, and then Sarah has a podcast as well. Gabe Brown, Don Huber, Gary Zimmer's on there twice, Dave Montgomery, Klaus Martins, Jerry Bernetti before he passed on, Joel Salatin, Mark Shepard. Listen to those. You will learn so much and you will not pay a dime and you will not regret it. Or you can listen to the same 10 country songs that sound like pop on loop. Those are your options. Good luck, folks.
Thank you very much to the panel. And thanks a lot.